Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time talking episodes 7 of 8 of Season 2 of The Legend of Korra, collectively called The Beginning. And guys, wow, what a story. It's been commented that this sort of feels like a mini movie all of its own. And that's a pretty accurate description of it. For something that's only about a little over 40 minutes, this is just a wonderfully epic story. Some of the best stuff we've seen not just on Korra, but in the Avatar universe, period. And it goes so deeply into the universe. We learn the origin of the Avatar. We learn so much about the world. It's just, hmm, these are some episodes Avatar fans are going to be geeking out over for years. So there's a lot to talk about. So let's just kind of get right into it. Got my notes right here. So now Korra is really just sort of a side character in all of this. This is really essentially the story of Wan, and it's interesting that apparently in Chinese Wan is the way you say 10,000, and this story takes place about 10,000 years before Korra's time. And I really love the art style that they use for the past, especially in the backgrounds. You can see it. It looks like those Chinese like ink washed paintings that you see with some influence from Japanese ukiyo-e art. But it makes it seem like you're like looking at least the backgrounds anyway, something that's in a storybook, and it really lends a very strong visual quality to the ethereal time in which this story is placed, a time that's been lost in history, a time that a time of myth and legends and that sort of thing. And of course, these episodes are really the story of Wan and his journey into becoming the first Avatar. And when we first meet him, it's interesting that out of everybody in the Avatar cast that we've really met so far, the person he's really most like is, of all people, Sokka. Although, if I had to pick any character that I could really say I think most heavily influenced Wan, I'd actually have to go for Aladdin from the Disney version. I mean, look at where he is when he's first see him. He's out there kind of just stealing food from people, being kind of a jerk about it. I mean, granted, obviously Wan's a good guy at heart. He's really just stealing food for his friends from people who are obviously quite well off and are hoarding the food in order to lord power over other people. So while he might be a bit of a smart mouth, Wan's a good guy at heart and is genuinely trying to do the right thing. And that's an interesting thing about Wan, is that he does go around and he does try to do the right thing. And it's just the unintended consequences of his actions that constantly haunt him, that ultimately end up driving him to becoming the Avatar. But even that is not enough. I mean, Wan is a guy who, in keeping with the whole Aladdin thing, he's the guy that lets the genie out of the bottle, and he's never able to get it back in. But anyway, let's get right into it. First of all, I have to give some major props to Steven Yeun, who's the guy who is guest starring this time around and doing the voice of Wan, and he is just phenomenal. And now he's best known, of course, as Glenn over on The Walking Dead, another show I have the fun of reviewing, and he's really great on this show. But here we get to see him just really kind of cut loose. You can see him really having fun with when Wan's excited and happy, and just conveying incredible depth when Wan is in despair, when he's suffering, when he's weighed down with his regrets. I mean, Steven has done some really great work on Walking Dead, but this is really, really some of the finest acting I've seen from him. And frankly, I think the folks out in Hollywood would be really foolish not to tap this guy for more voiceover work, because clearly he's got the talent for it. Anyways, I'm not going to run through a huge amount everything that we see this episode, but there were just so many really cool nods to the history of the Avatar universe, things that just in retrospect make sense, like when Wan starts learning bending from the spirits, we see him doing the dragon dance that Zuko and Aang did that they learned from the Sun Warriors and the statues there. One of the spirits that Juan meets in the forest is wearing a mask that looks suspiciously like the one that that guy from Spirited Away used. And another thing that I like about Juan is that, as I said, he sort of starts off. Well, of course, like I said, he's very much kind of like an Aladdin character, but he starts off as a guy who's mostly stuck using without his bending. He has to use his wits and his guile to get by, and is pretty good about it. Again, kind of like Sokka. And I also like that the first person, the first element that the person who ultimately becomes the first avatar starts with is fire. Because going back to the episode with the Sun Warriors, it is fire, it is the spark, it is the warmth that nurtures life. And it is in that spark that we find the events that ultimately lead to the creation of the avatar. And it's interesting that the avatar arose not because of some decision really by the spirits, but because of the actions of one man. One man trying to do good, but ultimately messing with forces that he didn't really understand. The avatar is an answer to a problem that humans created. And what I really like about that is that it really turns our expectations on our head. I imagine most of us probably assumed that the avatar arose as some sort of natural force, sort of chosen by whatever powers imbued people with bending in the first place. And of course, at the end of the first Avatar series, and here we get confirmation that, well, at the end of the first series, we saw that the dragon turtles can do energy bending. Here we see it was them that introduced bending to humans in the first place. And of course, this also kind of leads us into seeing the birth of the Avatar cycle and how it goes. First, Juan gets fire, then he gets air, then water, and then earth. Now, granted, this is, of course, different from the way Aang did it, but, Juan started in a very different place than Aang. And speaking of his characterization, it is interesting to kind of look at where he goes. At the first we see him, he's out there stealing foods, and then when he gets banished, he probably causes the death of at least three of the hunters, causes the death of three hunters, or at least the death of two of them, and one of them getting all mutated by a spirit, because they were trying to stop him from stealing their food. I mean, granted, it was an animal that ultimately became Juan's friend, but still, they were just like, hey, that's our food. And Juan uses his knowledge of the forest to essentially almost certainly kill two of them, and like I said, allow another one to be possessed and horribly mutated by a spirit. Not really very nice things to do there, Juan. But again, this is Juan as a young man. This is Juan when he's very immature and still, really wrapped up in himself. But it is his connection to the spirit, his willingness to be open-minded, that ultimately leads him to start down the path to becoming the Avatar. But again, like I said, so much of this is just of Juan's curse is that the unintended consequences of what it is that he does. When he tries to help out in the battle between Rava and Vantu, he thinks he's basically stopping a bully from picking on somebody. And of course, this ends up to him unleashing chaos into the world. But Juan, being a good guy, basically spends the rest of his life trying to atone for this mistake. And of course, it is that choice that makes him worthy of the trust and the power that Rava ultimately imbues in him. And it was really interesting to see that along the way, they were kind of had this sort of tag team thing where she would have to touch him to get the elements to switch. It's so very different, but it's an evolution of the Avatar. I mean, it's just really, really fascinating to me that at one point the Avatar couldn't freely switch between elements. There was a time before that. And it's just seeing that all come together and come together. That is really an amazingly apropos choice of words, because the Avatar spirit and the Avatar cycle are ultimately made possible by the merging of Wan and Rava's spirit. And of course, this continues down through the ages for 10,000 years until we get to Korra. And it is an interesting contrast between Wan and Korra. Korra, so much of what has defined her life has been being the Avatar, this legacy, this 10,000 year legacy that she follows up on. But Wan doesn't have that. Wan's just a guy. He's the guy who starts on the ground floor. And while this frees him from the burden of legacy, his own actions heap on him the burden of responsibility. Because as I said, Wan is responsible for the situation that literally changes the world. He's responsible for his friends having the courage to go out and leave their city and try and basically start a new nation on their own. And he is responsible for essentially all the destruction that comes from that. All of it unintended, of course. He just wanted to inspire his friends to stand up for themselves, to make their own choices, to find their own lives. But his friends ultimately made choices that led them to wage war on the spirits, his other friends. It was him inspiring himself on their own. They got his friend, the mutated dude, killed, along with so many other people. It was his decision to help Bantu that ultimately led to so many years of destruction. Led to the nations, the various benders, the proto-nations, I guess I should say, starting to fight each other. And all of this leads Wan to what? To dying on some forsaken battlefield alone. But because of his goodness, his sacrifice, his willingness to be open-minded, his courage and his bravery, all the things that, even as the spirits acknowledge, all the good things about humanity, this allows Batu to come to a realization, to a moment where she's willing to combine with Wan's power, with his soul, and continue this extraordinary partnership that they made together, this bridge between the spirit world and the human world, this bridge called the Avatar, this bridge that is now called Korra. I mean, there's just so much great stuff in this episode, like the battle between Batu and Wan. I mean, really, guys, I could just go on and on about how great all of this is. But I think this episode just really speaks for itself in terms of its own quality. I honestly, the only real mark I can think of against it is that this sort of puts Toph's story about Oma and Shu and the first earthbenders learning bending from the badger moles and pretty much chucks it out the window. But of course, you can basically just say, well, I guess that turned out to be a fairy tale after all. But still, just to really reiterate, this is one of the best stories that's ever been told in the Avatar universe. Visually, musically, acting. I mean, heck, we even find out just that the reason the Sky Bisons survived is, of all things, because they were protected by the Fire Sages. Which, of course, shows us a great insight into what was going on back when Aang's people were killed, that not everybody in the Fire Nation was cool with this. These Fire Sages rebelled against their own culture, their own leader, in order to protect these living creatures who are such an integral part of the Airbender culture. But anyway, like I said, this is just great, great stuff. And it really just shows us how spectacular the world of Avatar can be. And not only does it do that, I think it really raises the bar. As great as the series finale was for the last show, as great as the season finale was last year, I still have to think that this is even better. And the only reason that it doesn't quite pack as much punch as those is that simply this is just, we only have these 2 episodes to really get to know Juan and care about him. While previously we'd had at least a full season, up to 3, to really latch onto the characters and get them into our hearts. But just the fact that they do so much with so little time is an enormous testament to the skill and talent of the people behind this show. It's just mind-blowing. And I think I've made that point more than enough. Anyway, guys, I'm going to call it here. As always, please comment, rate, subscribe. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Who's Your Jedi. Till next time, take care and have a good one.